The smell of smoke is something you never forget. It gets into your skin, into your clothes, into your mind, and it stays there. Even now, months later, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the crackle of wood splitting apart, the sound of glass bursting from the heat, and the low, cruel laughter of the woman who set it all in motion. I never imagined that someone like hers, someone I only knew as Karen from the HOA, would destroy my life in one night. But life has a way of flipping itself upside down without warning. The funny thing is, the night it happened, I wasn't even home. I was at the hospital, sitting beside my mom's bed. She was recovering from hip surgery, and I'd been taking shifts with my sister to make sure she was never alone. My phone was charging in the wall when a neighbor called me. At first I thought he was joking. "Hey, you better get here." His voice trembled. "Your place is..." Then I heard it. Something collapsing. I grabbed my keys without thinking. I didn't even remember the drive. They're just flashes, the street blocked off by fire trucks. The orange glow that lit up the night sky like a sunrise from hell. And then my house, or what used to be my house. I remember stepping past the caution tape. A firefighter put a hand on my chest, telling me I couldn't go closer. But all I could do was stare. The roof had caved in. Smoke billowed out in thick waves, swallowing the moonlight. And then I saw her. She was standing just outside the crowd, arms folded, smirking. Karen, HOA president. Same woman who'd fined me 3 times last month for having unapproved. Exterior paint colors when all I'd done was repaint my front door navy blue. That smirk told me everything before the investigation even started. The weeks before that night had been a war. She'd harassed me over my lawn, my trash cans, my car parked half an inch over the HOA's designated limit. But it wasn't just me, she targeted my neighbors too. We all hated her, but she had power. She'd been running that HOA for 8 years, and she was the kind of person who believed power made her untouchable. I didn't speak to her that night. I couldn't. Every ounce of me was shaking, not just from anger, but from something worse, helplessness. I had nothing left. Every photo, every keepsake. The hand-carved coffee table my dad made before he passed gone, and the next morning, when the fire marshal ruled it suspicious, but didn't have enough to charge anyone yet. I felt like I was drowning. But here's where the story twists, because less than a week later, I was standing in a courtroom not as a victim, but as a judge. See, Karen didn't know who I really was. She thought I was just some guy with a regular job, struggling to keep up with her endless fines and rules. She had no idea I was the newly appointed district court judge for our county. I'd kept my personal life quiet, never flaunted it. When she walked into my courtroom that Friday morning for an entirely different case, one involving her being sued by another neighbor over harassment, our eyes locked. I've seen fear before. I've seen guilt. But what I saw in her that day was ignition. She knew in that moment that her life was about to change. But before I get to that, you need to know the fire wasn't just about property. It was personal. Flashback to months before the fire. It was late evening and I was painting my front porch railing. Karen showed up unannounced, clipboard in hand. She didn't knock, didn't greet me, just started pointing out violations. The railing color was not in harmony with the neighborhood palette. My mailbox looked worn and needed replacing. My driveway had cracks that lowered. Community value. I told her politely I'd handle it. She leaned closer and whispered, "You're new here, so let me give you some advice. People who don't follow the rules regret it." Then she smiled like she'd just done me a favor. From that day on, it was nonstop. Random inspections. Letters in my mailbox. Even petty things like removing the flowers I'd planted along the sidewalk, claiming they were unauthorized. Vegetation. I thought I could outlast her. I thought ignoring her would make her lose interest. But people like Karen, they don't stop. They escalate. Back to the night of the fire, witnesses said they saw a woman matching her description near my house an hour before it started. But there was no camera footage, no direct proof. And in the eyes of the law, suspicion isn't enough. Still, when she stood in my courtroom, my gavel in hand, I realized something. I couldn't let my emotions control my judgment. I couldn't retaliate. but I could make sure the truth came out. That morning, she was representing herself. Bad idea, by the way. The plaintiff, an elderly man named Howard, claimed she'd threatened to fine him into bankruptcy if he didn't tear down the shed in his backyard. Howard's wife had been sick, and the shed was where he stored her medical supplies. Karen laughed off the accusations in court. She rolled her eyes. She even interrupted me once, which, let's just say, isn't something I recommend doing to a judge. But as Howard testified, something clicked. His story mirrored mine. The intimidation, the threats, the abuse of power. I kept my composure. But inside, I was boiling. And then, the plaintiff's lawyer dropped something unexpected. A stack of photos from a private investigator. They showed Karen trespassing on Howard's property, removing items from his shed. In one photo, she was wearing the same jacket witnesses had described the night of my fire. Remember the way she froze when those photos hit the table? Her smirk vanished. Her voice cracked when she tried to explain. I adjourned the case for the day, but I knew this was just the beginning. Later that week, a detective came to my office. New evidence had surfaced security footage from a neighbor's backyard camera that showed a partial view of my property the night of the fire. And there, in the corner of the frame, was Karen. You have to understand the moment I saw that. Every emotion hit me at once. Relief, rage, and something else. Vindication. I can't tell you how this ends yet. Not here, because the real ending. It's not just about catching her. It's about what happens when someone who's abused their power finally has. To answer for it, in front of the very person they thought they'd destroyed. And when you see what happened next, you'll understand why this is the most personal case of my life. So stay with me until the end, because when I tell you how Karen's smirk turned into a plea for mercy, you won't believe it. The footage wasn't crystal clear, grainy black and white, edges warped from an old security system, but it was enough. The figure in the frame wasn't just a shadow, it was a person. And the way she moved, I recognized it instantly. Karen had this stiff, self-important stride, like she was walking through an invisible spotlight. In the video, she paused near my driveway, glancing around. The timestamp read 11:42 p.m., 40 minutes before the first flames were reported. She held something in her right hand, wrapped in a cloth, and then she disappeared out of frame, toward the side of my house. The detective, a man named Ruiz, leaned over my desk. We're getting this enhanced. Should be enough to at least bring her in for questioning. I didn't move, didn't speak. My fingers were locked together so tightly they hurt. I knew I couldn't be directly involved in the investigation. Judicial ethics are clear. I had to stay out of anything that could be seen as personal retribution. But inside, I was split in two. The judge in me knew to trust the system. The man who'd lost his home wanted to kick that door in and demand answers. Ruiz left, and I sat in my office long after sunset. Outside, the courthouse was quiet, the kind of quiet you only notice when you're alone with your thoughts. I remembered my dad telling me once, "The law is slow, son." But slow doesn't mean weak. I clung to that, even though patience felt impossible. 3 days later, Karen was back in my courtroom for Howard's harassment case. She came in looking rattled, hair less perfect, makeup lighter, like she'd rushed to get there. But she still had that posture, that sense of superiority. Howard's attorney called a new witnesser, landscaper, who worked in the neighborhood. He testified that Karen had approached him about cleaning up properties that didn't meet her standards, including mine. He claimed she'd even joked about how accidents happen to people who don't listen. The courtroom went still. Karen crossed her arms, smirking again, but it looked thinner now, forced. I kept my expression neutral, though every muscle in my jaw screamed to react. That night, I didn't go straight home to my temporary rental. I drove past what was left of my house. The debris was still there, blackened and warped. I stood on the sidewalk, hands in my pockets, breathing in the faint trace of burned wood that still lingered. It was strange how something that used to feel like home could now look like a crime scene from someone else's life. But it wasn't. Someone else's, it was mine, and the person who'd done it was still walking free. Flashback 5 years earlier. Back then, I wasn't a judge. I was a defense attorney, working long hours, barely home enough to mow my lawn. I lived in a small apartment downtown, nowhere near an HOA. I remember my first thought when I bought this house. Peace, okay? A yard, a place to build a future. I didn't know I was moving into a battlefield with a self-appointed general, Karan introduced herself. Within hours of me unloading boxes, she didn't bring cookies or flowers. She brought a binder, rules, regulations, approved paint colors. She said most people don't read this until they've already messed up. I like to give newcomers a head start. I'd laugh then, thinking she was just overly enthusiastic. If I'd known what that binder would turn into, I might have left right then. Back to the present, Ruiz called me at 7 a.m. the next morning. We got her. Those 3 words jolted me awake faster than coffee ever could. They'd picked her up at her home, charging her with arson and trespassing based on the footage, the witness statements, and most damning residue from an accelerant found in her garage. She posted bail within hours. Money wasn't her problem, control was. The next time I saw her, she wasn't in my courtroom. She was across from me in the grocery store parking lot. I got gone there early to avoid running into people, but fate wasn't feeling generous that day. She walked toward me like nothing had happened. A tough week, huh? She said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. I hope you're not taking any of this personally. You know how rumors spread? I didn't answer. I just got in my car, closed the door, and drove off. But my hands were shaking on the wheel the whole way home. That night I sat at my kitchen table, looking at the only surviving item from my old house, a photo of my parents on their wedding day. I'd found it in the debris, edges singed, but the image intact. I thought about how hard they'd worked to give me a sense of security, and how easily someone like Karen could rip it away. 2 weeks later, the harassment case took a sharp turn. Karen's attorney knew. One requested a continuance, citing unexpected developments. That's when I learned she was now facing civil suits from 3 other neighbors, all with eerily similar stories. And one of them claimed she'd threatened to burn down their gazebo if they didn't remove it. It wasn't just me. She'd been doing this for years. During a recess, I overheard her speaking to her lawyer in the hallway. They're all lying, she hissed. They think they can make me the villain. They'll regret it. Her voice cracked on that last part. It was the first time I'd heard a fracture in her confidence. That evening, Ruiz called again. Her trial date's been set for the arson case. 6 weeks from now. He hesitated. You know, you might be called as a witness, right? I did know, and I knew what that meant. For once, the roles would reverse. I wouldn't be the one holding the gavel. I'd be the one telling my story under oath. In the weeks that followed, I kept working my cases, but there was an edge to everything. Every time I walked into the courtroom, I felt the shadow of what was coming. The thought of facing her again, this time in a different building, under a different set of rules, was both terrifying and satisfying. But then something happened that shook me more than the fire itself. One night I got home to find an envelope taped to my door. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 4 words. You're making a mistake. Dumber. Signature. No explanation. It's just that I reported it to Ruiz immediately. He thought it could be from Karen or someone connected to her, trying to intimidate me. They increased patrols near my rental. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of another kind of attack, one aimed at my mind, not my house. Sleep didn't come easy after that. I'd wake up at 3 a.m., convinced I heard footsteps outside. Every creak in the floorboards made my pulse spike, and then came the pre-trial hearing. Karen walked in wearing a pale blue suit, hair pinned back neatly, as if she were attending a charity luncheon instead of a felony proceeding. She smiled at the reporters, even waved at one. When the prosecutor outlined the evidence of the footage, the accelerant, the witness testimonies kept, her gaze fixed on a point just above his head, like she was bored. But when they mentioned my name as a potential witness, she turned her head slightly, eyes locking with mine across the room. There it was again, that flicker. The recognition that she no longer controlled the board. Driving home that day, I realized something important. This wasn't just about punishing her for what she'd done to me. This was about stopping her from doing it to anyone else. She'd built a little empire of fear in that neighborhood, one rule at a time. She thought she could burn down anyone who challenged her. I wasn't going to let that happen again, the night before the trial. I walked past the ruins of my house one last time. The city would be clearing the debris soon, but I wanted to see it as it was ugly, broken, and honest. I stood there for an hour, listening to the wind move through what used to be my living room, and I made myself a promise. When I took that stand, I wouldn't just tell the court what she did. I'd make them feel what it was like to stand in the ashes of your own life. The courtroom was colder than I remembered. Not in temperature, though the air conditioning was doing its job, but in atmosphere. People moved quieter here. Conversations were whispers, and every sound carried farther than you expected. Karen sat at the defense table, her attorney flipping through a thick folder. She didn't look at me when I walked in, but I could feel her noticing. That's the thing about certain people, you can sense when their attention is on you, even if they're pretending otherwise. The prosecutor, Martin Hayes, met me in the hallway. "We'll go over everything one more time before you take the stand," he said. His tone was calm, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. He wanted my testimony to hit hard, not just on facts, but on impact. The first witness was one of my neighbors, a quiet man named Lewis, who'd lived 2 houses down. He described seeing Karen near my driveway that night, her face partially hidden by a scarf. He admitted he hadn't thought much of it until he saw the fire trucks later. His voice shook when he said he regretted not calling it in immediately. Karen's attorney tried to chip away at him, suggesting he might have mistaken her for someone else. Lewis didn't waver. "I know what I saw," he said. "I've lived near her for a decade. Don't mistake Karen for anyone else." I was called next. Walking to the witness stand felt strange. Every step was deliberate. Like I was walking into a spotlight I couldn't step out of. I raised my hand, took the oath, and sat down. Hayes started simple. "Can you tell the court where you were?" "On the night of September 14th. At the hospital," I said. Our voice was steady. "With my mother, after her surgery." We went through the timeline, the phone call from Lewis, the drive back, the first sight of my house, in flames. I kept my words clear, factual, but Hayes pushed me to describe what I'd felt. "It's hard to explain," I said finally. "You don't think about possessions in that moment. You think about memories. My father's tools, my mother's. Recipe books. Things that can't be replaced. It's like someone reached into your life and tore out pieces of you just to prove they could." Karen shifted in her seat at that. Not much, but enough that I noticed. Hayes moved on to my history. With her, how she'd targeted me with repeated fines and demands. The defense objected, claiming it was irrelevant, but the judge overruled. Then Hayes brought up the footage. "You've seen this video, correct? Yes? And who do you believe the person in this footage to be?" "Karen," I said without hesitation. The defense attorney pounced. "Belief is not proof, Your Honor. My client cannot be convicted on the basis of a neighbor's grudge." But Hayes wasn't finished. He had the enhanced version of the video queued up. When it played, the figure in the frame was clearer, still grainy, but the posture. The way she glanced over her shoulder, it was unmistakable. The defense tried to suggest it could have been someone mimicking her walk. That's when Hayes dropped the accelerant evidence. The same chemical compound found at my home was found in a container in Karen's garage. For the first time since the trial began, her expression cracked. She leaned toward her attorney, whispering rapidly. Flashback 3 weeks before the fire. I'd been on my porch, watering plants, when Karen walked by. She stopped at the edge of my driveway and just stared. No greeting, no small talk. Finally, she said, "You know, people who make themselves too comfortable here tend to find that comfort taken away." Then she walked off, leaving me with the kind of unease you can't quite shake. Back to the trial, the cross-examination came next. The defense tried to paint me as biased, too emotionally involved, to be objective. I stayed calm, answering each question directly. I could feel Karen's eyes on me the entire time, even when I wasn't looking at her. When my testimony ended, I stepped down and walked past her table. For a moment, our eyes met. There was no smirk this time, just something colder. The trial stretched into the afternoon. Hayes brought in the fire marshal, who testified about the origin point of the fire and how it was consistent with deliberate ignition. Then came Howard, the elderly neighbor from my courtroom, who told the jury about Karen's threats and how she'd trespassed on his property before. The defense tried to discredit him, but Hayes countered with photos from the private investigator photos that not only showed her on Howard's property but wearing the same jacket from the footage near my house by the time court adjourned for the day. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. The jurors weren't leaning back casually anymore. They were leaning forward, listening. That night, I sat in my rental's living room, the silence pressing in, kept thinking about my dad's words that the law is slow but not weak. We're moving toward something now. It wasn't victory yet, but it was closer than it had ever been. 2 days later, prosecution called Ruiz. He went through the investigation step by step, laying out how the pieces fit together. The footage, the witness accounts, the accelerant, the matching jacket. Every fact landed like a nail in the coffin. But then came the defense's surprise. They brought in a woman named Sheila, someone who claimed she was with Karen the night of the fire. She said they'd been having dinner at her house until after midnight. Hayes tore into the timeline. "What time did you start dinner?" He asked. "Around 9, she said. "And what time did she leave?" "After midnight." He pulled up phone records showing Karen's phone had pinged a tower near my house at 11:40 p.m. Sheila hesitated, her voice faltering as she tried to explain. It was clear to everyone in that room her story didn't hold. During the recess, I stepped outside to clear my head. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and onlookers, all buzzing about the trial. Somewhere in the noise I heard someone say, "She's going down." I didn't turn to see who it was. Flashback to days after the fire. I'd been standing in the wreckage, sifting through ashes with gloves on. The heat was still lingering in the soil. That's when I found the photo of my parents. I remember holding it up, the edges crumbling in my fingers, and thinking, this is all that's left. Back inside the courtroom, the defense rested. The closing arguments were set for the next day. I knew whatever happened, this moment, the moment she realized she could no longer manipulate her way out, was coming. That night I didn't sleep. I kept replaying every interaction we'd had over the years, every warning she'd given, every smirk, and I thought about what it would mean. For the neighborhood if she walked free. The morning of the closings, Karen arrived earlier than usual. She wore black, no jewelry, hair pulled back. It wasn't humility, it was strategy. Her attorney spoke first, trying to sow doubt. My client is a strict HOA president, yes. But being strict does not make you an arsonist. Then Hayes stood up. His voice was calm, deliberate. This case isn't about HOA rules. It's about control. And when the defendant felt her control threatened, she took it back in the most destructive way possible. You've seen the evidence, the witnesses, and you know the truth. As he spoke, I watched the jurors. Their eyes stayed on him, not one glance toward Karen. The judge dismissed them to deliberate. Hours passed. The waiting was worse than the testimony, worse than the cross-examination. I walked the halls, sat in the bench outside, checked my watch 100 times, and then the bailiff called us back in. The jury had reached a verdict. When the jurors filed back in, the room seemed to shrink. Every shuffle of their feet, every creak of the benches felt louder than it should. I kept my eyes on the foreperson, a middle-aged woman with steady hands and a face that gave nothing away. The clerk asked if they'd reached a verdict. "We have," the foreperson said. Karen's attorney straightened his papers, though I noticed the slight tremor in his fingers. Karen herself sat very still, lips pressed together, eyes locked forward. The clerk read the verdict. On the charge of arson in the first degree, guilty. On the charge of criminal trespass, guilty. The words landed like a physical blow, not to me, but to her. Her shoulders stiffened, her jaw tightened. It was the first time I'd ever seen her without an expression of control. The judge thanked the jury. dismissed them, and set a date for sentencing. And just like that, it was over, or at least that chapter was. People began to shuffle out. Conversations starting up again in low murmurs. I stayed seated, watching her. She turned slightly toward her lawyer, whispering something sharp. He didn't respond. As I stood to leave, I passed near her table. For the briefest moment, our eyes met again. There was no smirk, no glare, just an emptiness I didn't recognize. It almost looked like disbelief, as if she truly believed she could burn my home to the ground and still walk away untouched. Flashback for days after the fire. I was sitting in my sister's kitchen, staring into a mug of untouched coffee. My sister kept telling me to eat, to rest. But all I could think about was the fact that someone had taken away the place I'd worked so hard for. It didn't feel real yet. Felt like I was living in some in-between space where the past was gone, but the future hadn't started. Back to the present, the courthouse steps were crowded. Reporters called out questions, cameras flashing. I kept my head down and made my way to my car. Ruiz was waiting for me there. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. "Better than I've been in months," she appealed, he said. "But with the evidence we have, I don't see it going anywhere." I liked him. But belief and peace aren't the same thing. That night, I drove past the neighborhood. I didn't stop, didn't look for long, but I needed to see it. Some houses still had their porch lights on. Life had gone on there, even with everything that had happened. A few weeks later came the sentencing. Karen entered the courtroom in a county jumpsuit this time. Her hair was still neat, but without her tailored suits and practiced smile, she looked smaller. The prosecutor laid out the impact statements, including mine. I spoke about what it meant to lose not just a home, but a sense of safety, that invisible thing you don't notice until it's gone. The judge sentenced her to 15 years. With the possibility of parole after 10, when the gavel came down, a hush fell over the room. Karen didn't react at first, then she glanced back at me. There was something in her eyes I hadn't seen before. It wasn't hate. It wasn't fear. It was the realization that the world she'd built for herself, the one where she made the rules, was gone. Afterward, Howard caught up to me outside. He thanked me, said the neighborhood felt lighter already. I told him it wasn't just MIT, it was everyone who came forward. Everyone who refused to stay quiet. Before the fire, I'd been sitting in my living room reading when I heard a knock. It was Howard. He'd come to warn me. "She's after you now," he said. "Be careful." I'd laughed it off then, thinking he meant more fines, more letters. Hadn't understood how far she'd go. Back to the present, I stood in what used to be my yard a week later. The debris had been cleared. It was just an empty lot now, flat dirt where my house had stood. The city had offered to help me rebuild, and insurance was covering more than I'd expected. But it wasn't about the structure anymore. It was about knowing that no one would stand on this spot again and think they had the right to destroy it. I thought about my parents, about my dad's words. The law is slow, but not weak. And sometimes the slow road is the only one worth taking, because when you get to the end, you didn't lose yourself along the way. That night I went back to my rental and took the photo of my parents from the shelf. The edges were still charred, but the smiles were untouched. I put it in a new frame, not to hide the damage, but to remind myself that survival always carries its scars. Weeks passed. Life began to feel normal again, or at least a new version of normal. I went back to my cases, back to the routine of hearings and rulings. The neighborhood elected a new HOA board. Howard called to say things were peaceful now. Then, one morning, I received a letter from an inmate. No return name, but I knew the handwriting. Karen's. It was short. I thought I understood power. I didn't. I thought I could bend people to my will. I couldn't. You taught me that. You didn't mean to, but you did. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know I finally see it. I read it twice, then set it down. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel pity. I just felt done. Because in the end, this wasn't about her learning a lesson. It was about me getting my life back. And I had. The smell of smoke still visits me sometimes. In a faint wisp from a barbecue grill, in the charred edges of a campfire log. Not the same as it was that night. It doesn't choke me anymore. Now, it reminds me of something else. That even when the worst has burned everything you know to the ground, you can still rebuild. And sometimes, the person who tried to destroy you ends up trapped in the ruins they made for themselves.